pleasure and a privilege to introduce Professor Danny Dorling from the Department of Geography. We've got a number of geographers here today, so you'll all be very familiar with Danny's work. But for those of you who aren't, he's done extremely important and influential work, particularly on issues of inequality. So over to you, Danny.
Thank you. Okay, what I want to try and do is explain the kind of things that people like me find particularly interesting at the moment. And I'm very interested in what you find interesting as well, or what you don't like about the kind of things that I'm looking at, and what things you think academics should be looking at more. Inequality seems to be centre stage since 2008. The differences between what people have got and what happens to them, and whether it's fair, and the outcomes. The major news story today across Europe is that the banks in Cyprus are currently closed today. It's a bank holiday, and we'll find out by the end of the day how much money they're taking out of people's bank accounts. The bankers have got a choice in Cyprus, or the politicians who are meeting in their parliament today, of whether to take only money out of the bank accounts of people who've got over 100,000 euros, or to take money out of the bank accounts of everybody. And it's a question of what's fair, what's going on. It matters to you at an obvious level in that if the European banking system were to collapse in the next 4 days, you're going to be worrying about how to get food. You have an advantage, you're young, you're fit, you're clever, you're probably going to beat people like me. I benefit from being part of the system. I have a job, I have a mortgage, I have everything else. But if it were to come to a sort of survival of the fittest fight, I'm afraid I would lose out. There's that kind of immediate, why does it matter to you what's going on? There's another extreme about why it matters to you. This is a map which shows the world shaped, where each country is drawn with its area in proportion to the number of people who die having made it to their first birthday, but don't make it to their 5th birthday. Almost all these deaths are avoidable. A few deaths of newborn babies are not avoidable. No matter what you do, you couldn't prevent them occurring. But by the time a baby reaches 1, there's almost no reason why it shouldn't reach the age of 5. So you're looking at the world shaped, in effect, by a degree of callousness and what we don't care about. The large yellow country near to me is India. Pakistan is just above it. China, you'll notice in green, if you're looking at walk maps, is much smaller, and the map is dominated by Africa, by particular parts of Africa. So it's a map of unfairness. So I'm giving you 2 sorts of extreme reasons about why you might be bothered. You might be bothered because inequality could actually result in an economic collapse and things going badly wrong in your lifetime. And you could be bothered because you're concerned about global inequalities and how bad they are. But there's also a middle route as well, which in a way is a bit more boring, I think, than those extreme ones. So I hope we can get back to the extreme ones. But the middle one is to talk about, well, we're living in a rich country. There aren't that many rich countries in the world. Is our rich country a particularly well organised rich country, or particularly badly organised rich country? This little table is showing you just one measure of inequality, income inequality, for the 25 richest countries in the world that have at least 1 million people. Most of these are in Europe, so they're shown in black, and they range from Singapore, which is the most unequal of the rich countries in the world, to Japan, which is the most equal. I should say, a lot of these things are disputed, by the way, and we spend a lot of our time writing papers trying to show that Japan really is the most equal place, and so on. This is the ratio between what the best off tenth of people get in income every year and the poorest tenth get in income every year. And in Singapore, the best off get about almost 18 times more than the poorest tenth, whereas in Japan, the best off get about 4.5 times what the poorest get. And the key question is, does this matter? Does it have an effect? Can you run a society well in the case of Japan, where you're paying people at the bottom that much. You could argue, and a lot of people argue actually it isn't that much to get 4 times less than people at the top. But it is quite expensive. People who clean rooms like this in Japan are paid a lot more than people who clean rooms like this in Britain. Surely this can't work. Surely it's economically inefficient. Surely Japan is heading downwards economically. In contrast, Singapore, very successful small nation, is it successful because it's allowed inequality to grow this high? It's rewarded the people who've got effort at the top and helped them do better. And it hasn't looked after the people at the bottom because you don't want to look after them because they're just a drain on you. You could argue that. But I'm going to concentrate on us and a little bit about Portugal as well. Because we're quite like Singapore. We're not that far from Singapore. The best off tenth in Britain get almost 10 times the income of the worst off tenth of people. We're part of the group of unusually unequal countries. USA is the most famous one in this group, but we're very close. And we're moving nearer. Just before the election in 2010, our MP for this area, anybody know who the MP? It's probably Clegg. They've moved the boundaries actually. I think it is still Clegg.
It is Clegg.
It is Clegg, yeah. It doesn't matter actually because it's a huge number of votes, isn't it? Just in this immediate, if you were to move the boundary just a few hundred metres. Anyway, Clegg, just before May 2010, complained that under the previous Labour government, the gap between the richest and the poorest had grown. And the amount by which it had grown, which Clegg didn't say, but you could work it out, was it moved us a quarter of the way towards becoming as unequal as the United States. And that was in about 13 years under New Labour. The interesting thing for me is that although he complained about it, since the election, the gap between the rich and poor has grown even faster. So I suspect we've moved another quarter of the way to becoming as unequal as the United States in just 2 years. So that's where we're heading. The contrast is always with the countries at the bottom: Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland and Japan. These are very different countries. Here's the same thing, just drawn as a graph, just to try and give you an idea about the importance of this. And it's all about how much people at the top are paid, as opposed to how much people at the bottom are paid, and also what your levels of benefits are. When I was your age, which was 25 years ago, in Britain, I was allowed to sign on for an employment benefit in the summer. That was still allowed for students. But more importantly, the unemployment benefit was in real terms twice what it is today, twice as much. It's about 21, about a fifth, I think, of this is male earnings, is what's always used, but male average earnings, about a fifth. It's now about 11%, it's halved. Unemployment benefit in Britain used to be something that if you were middle class, you could think you could actually rely on for a short amount of time. It was part of your insurance. As it hasn't increased, as it's got so low that it's about £9 a day, JSA.
71 a week.
How much?
£71 a week.
£71 a week. Large numbers of people simply do not imagine living off that. Do not do it. As your society becomes more and more pulled apart, what people at one end can imagine living off becomes very different from what people at the other end can imagine living off. The median country in the rich world is the Netherlands. The Netherlands is the average country for inequality. There are lots of countries that are more equal than the Netherlands, lots of countries that are more unequal. So I always think the Netherlands, partly because it's geographically close to us, is worth looking at if you want to know what a realistic alternative to Britain might be, rather than say looking at Japan or Norway, which are much more equal, but I'll show you in a minute why in one case they've got to that point. Advert. I'm interested in looking at inequality in all kinds of ways. So the thing I've been doing most recently is looking at tube lines, looking at inequalities along tube lines, and life expectancy gaps along them. And you've probably heard about how if you go to the East End of London, every stop you go is a year off your life. Have you heard of that? Or some of you nodding? The interesting thing with the Central Line is it's certainly true. The Central Line is the red one that goes right through the middle of London. It's certainly true that as you head towards Mile End and Bethnal Green, you have that drop. But the same thing happens twice before in London. It happens round about here, and it happens down near Shepherd's Bush as well. So we have incredible inequalities within cities like London. It's not simple east and west. There are lots of other pockets of inequalities going on. Inside Sheffield, you're looking at about a 12, 13 year difference in life expectancy between, say, an area like this, Ranmore, forgetting about the students. Students are always tricky when it comes to working out life expectancy, because you put this incredibly healthy group of people into an area and it makes it look like it's fine. But if you just go to Ranmore out of here, you're looking at living 12 to 13 years more than the area immediately below the university, heading down to Upperthorpe for people. These are incredibly wide gaps. The biggest gap in Sheffield is about 19 years between a little village called Worrell on the outside and parts of the middle. There's a quote from the book just about life expectancy moving or changing. Let me tell you a little bit about you and life expectancy. The way things are currently going, if there isn't a complete collapse in banking this week and across Europe, about a quarter of you to a third of you are looking to live into age 100. It's a long time away. No other population in human history has been looking at that. Currently it's almost all the women in the room. Hardly any of the men are probably going to make it to 100, but it's about a 5-year difference. That's what you're heading towards at the moment. However, because it's a very unequal country and society that you're living in, some of you aren't going to do that well. Just to worry you slightly, but one of the worst positions you can be in Britain is to do quite well when you're young, do well educationally when you're 15, say get to a good university, be really enthusiastic, come to a course like this and so on. Maybe get yourself quite a good starter job at age 21, 22, but in midlife things go wrong. Often involving getting ill when you didn't mean to, very often involving splitting up with somebody you didn't want to split up with. The job doesn't go well and so on. And when we look at these kind of things, we find that people who started off well in life but something doesn't go that well for them in their 30s or 40s, they end up living 20 odd years less than other people. So part of living in an unequal society is that some of you can think you're going to do very well, but of course some of you have to do not so well for those to do well. You can't all be in the top 1%. There isn't enough room. It's only got enough room for 1 in 100 people. You see what I mean? There are lots of arguments about why inequality might be bad for us. Shall I start off and give you a few about why inequality might be good for us? I'll do that for an attempt to balance, because you're going to see where I sit fairly soon anyway. Good things about inequality or living in an unequal society. One which is fairly definite is the rate of suicide is lower in unequal rich societies. The one thing that goes bad in equal societies is you tend to have a higher suicide rate. You get a degree of conformity in more equal societies. It's maybe easier to be a maverick in an unequal society. I'll challenge you to think of other ones so that we can have a more fun conversation in a bit. But there are certainly things that are better in some cases in more unequal societies, although you have to look at why. But there's lots and lots and lots of things that are worse in more unequal societies. Some simple ones are that people organise themselves worse. It's harder in an unequal society, think of the United States of America, to say let's all have a train system that moves us around well. It's easier to say let's rely on cars. If you earn enough money, you can get yourself a nice car, you can get to where you want in your car, it's your responsibility, you look after your car. If you don't look after your car, it goes wrong. If you don't have a car, it's because you're not good enough to have a car, because you haven't tried hard enough. So we don't need cars for the people who are not good enough to have one. one of the difficulties of going for that kind of idea, saying that's how you want to run things, when it comes to health, is that you end up with people consuming a lot of gasoline. And if people consume a lot of gasoline, it means that they're sitting in the car. It's because you can't consume a lot of gasoline without sitting in the car, burning it away, pressing at the pedal. Sitting in a car is one of the best ways to get fat. Human bodies were not designed to spend all day sitting, but it's very strange that you're all sitting watching me now. And there's this lovely relationship worldwide. This book was done by Ian Roberts and the colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, between the average body mass index and the amount at which we use gasoline. Now this is used in lots of countries, and you could say it's largely about poverty and so on. But if you look at the richest countries in the world, people are thinnest in Japan, which is a country which has had the number of cars has been decreasing for over 20 years every year, and which has train systems which work and so on. Where in fact owning a car isn't an indicator of wealth. What does it tell you about somebody in Japan if they own a car? Lazy? No.
Their preference of travel. Their preference of travel.
Getting there, but
Rural.
rural, yeah. People in remote villages have a car. You wouldn't have a car in the city, because why would you need a car in the city? And that's different. Whereas, got a clue, go and see if you can guess. I was coming up from London on Thursday, was it Friday? Friday last week. I got an early train from London. And there were two men sitting opposite me who obviously hadn't used the train much, they said, because they didn't know how to work out their tickets about where they were booked. And it was clear they should have been in first class. It became very clear. They had the right cufflinks for first class. One thing which was really interesting was that they were hiding their job from me. You can work out what their job was. No, even more embarrassing, politicians.
Bankers.
They were bankers. They were coming to HSBC, who have got a sort of secondary headquarters here. And it was fascinating to watch the fact that they went quiet every time they wanted to talk about a bank thing. It wasn't just a it was they were not interested in that. But the other thing, every time they talked about a friend or a colleague, almost every time, can you guess what they mentioned about that man? Always a man. The car he drove. Yeah, it was just unbelievable. Now I'm being unfair because academics, particularly in the States, are famous for not caring about their cars because they get status in another way. Whereas, if you work in the private sector like this, it's about money, and what you do with your money, you buy that flash car and you can tell if a man is good. The other thing they talked about, to be fair about them, see if you can guess this. So after the car, what was the next thing they talked about? The bloke.
The suits.
The suits.
White.
No, it wasn't. Not with me. It wasn't. You're going to, because the third of you at least are going to end up in this business.
House prices.
It wasn't. Well, house prices in Madrid, where one of them was based, I should say. No, but I actually asked about house prices because I wanted to know. This is interesting. You're not on the right. Not salaries, or you require. There's something else about the men that they knew and what else they did.
Goals.
Yeah.
Dress code.
Just code. No, they.
Elections.
Somebody shouts, I think.
Golf.
Golf, almost. The
Hobbies.
sports. Whether they played rugby, football, what was their sport that they did? You have to have a sport. Well, this is anecdote. This is only one train journey. I'd love to see it done before. Yeah, one was paranoid he had the wrong tie. And they were going to go and buy a tie before they went to their meeting. It's a highly paid man. But part of my reason, come back to the reason for saying this, how people dress and how they look and how they behave in a more unequal society, it does begin to matter. I would not, it's interesting, that's what you would do, women have more freedom over this. I would not go to a senior university meeting now without wearing a suit. I just wouldn't, I personally wouldn't do it. I can't wear ties because my neck's too fat. And I can't do my button up either. But, it's very hard to be that different in a more unequal society because you have to dress like the group you're in. If you don't dress like the group you're in, people notice it. They assume you're somebody else that you're not, and they look at you differently, or they don't look at you at all, which is worth. Do any of you have a job where you do waiting on tables at all? Waiters, waiteresses? Anybody done that? You're not going to admit to it now, are you? So once you talk about inequality in class, people go quiet. Don't ask what I do. How people treat people who wait on them at tables changes in different societies. So in more equal societies, like Greece would be an example, but certainly Japan, you don't give tips. There's no culture of giving a tip. It would be insulting to give a tip. People are paid enough anyway. The more unequal society is, the larger the tip is. We're about, how much would you tip if you're having a meal?
We're students.
You don't ever?
There's no rule with how much you tip when you're a student.
Isn't.
Whatever change you've got in your pocket.
You give. Any other opinions on that? What?
I say 10%.
10%? Shout out more?
Yeah, 10 to 20.
10 to 20?
Approximately 10% depending on what's in your pocket.
Okay. Okay, what do you think it is in the States?
20.
About 20, yeah. Different.
You tip for more things as well. I got my ear pierced and had to tip the guy for piercing my ear, which I just didn't understand, and my friend was like, "You give a tip." I
Yeah.
was like, "What? Really?
Yeah.
Why do you tip in restaurants?"
When I was getting a cab in America, my boyfriend was like, make sure you've got enough money to tip because they'll get angry at you if you don't. In India, you have to tip when you take money out of an ATM machine. You have to tip him.
The people who are next to the ATM machine.
But also, it's
Are you
like,
sure?
but I was talking about Haiti with the, I can't remember his name now, but that they didn't really even, like, when they were tipped, you could see them put it straight in their pocket. They didn't share it. Do you know what I mean? So
Yes, you put it
that
straight
wasn't
in.
part of their culture.
Oh, all necessity. I was in India at Christmas. You can tell I'm a well-off professor. You can go off to India at Christmas. In the most equal part of India. Anybody know which part this is?
Mumbai.
No, but Mumbai's getting a lot better. I was in Mumbai 20 years ago. So it's go places now, and then don't go and go 20 years time if you really want to see change. Go on.
I'm not sure what it's called, but I also know that like in that part of India they only have like one child, not 2 people.
Yes, it's really low.
Yes.
It's Kerala, yeah. I went to Kerala for the first time. Kerala's always put up as a poster kind of child of relatively equal poor countries. And Kerala's an Indian state. Anybody know who it's voted for democratically for the last 50 years? Which political party controls Kerala? Socialist, but even more.
Marxist.
They're Marxist. Well, maybe
Marxist,
they're communists. Yeah, Kerala's had a communist party for 50 years, democratically elected continuously. So I went to see what Kerala's like, and the interesting thing, it's worth going. It's beautiful. Levels of begging are absolutely minimal. People don't beg in a country where they are supported, but you still tip. You still are expected to tip. And the inequalities between people are quite high. And if you tip somebody 100 rupees is at the bottom of society, the look on their face as they quietly get rid of the money before their boss sees it, it's like giving somebody £100. And 100 rupees is £1. And that's the kind of scary and slightly horrible thing about inequality. Even in the most, Costa Rica and Cuba, the other kind of areas, but one of the most equal parts of the poor world, a £1 tip can have a huge effect on somebody's life, and it makes you feel a bit dirty and bad as well, and then they rely on it. Shall I get back to the lecture? This is more fun than that. Okay. I'm interested in what you think about this one. This is about the top 1%. And this graph's about France and the UK. And we've measured how much the top 1% have ever since we've taxed them. So since we've had taxes that depend on your income, you've been able to work out how much the best of 1% have got. France has done a better job of this, so it's got more of a series. You see a little dot up there for the UK. Way back in the 1930s, the best of 1 in 100 people in the UK got almost a fifth of all income. And this is normal in many countries. This is when you had upstairs, downstairs, you know, kind of Downton Abbey society where the rich have servants and so on. The best off 1% take a fifth of all income. That fell in both France and the UK throughout the 30s, the 40s and the 50s, to reach a point for the UK around about 1978 when the best off 1% took about 6 times average income, or 6% of all income. So that's the most equal we've ever been in Britain. And then we had this great big rise up to that latest figure, it's probably about 2008, of about 15%, but it's heading back up to 20% now. Partly because average incomes in Britain are now going down, median incomes are going down. The interesting thing is that in France it didn't do the same thing. You can see a bit of a rise in France, and then a little bit of a rise more recently. Those are the grey diamonds near me. That was Sarkozy, making France more competitive. But these two countries have really pulled apart. So if you're in the best off 1% in France, you'll be taking home half as much as if you're in the best off 1% in Britain. And it's very different. The key question is why, or what happened? What happened in the late 1970s or the 80s to continue that difference? If you're in favour of inequality, what you say is, well, you get the best of France. What happens is we attract very large numbers of French people. I think it's almost the biggest, maybe after America, the biggest minority group by country of birth in London. So you attract lots of French people over who want to be able to get more money, and they come in London and work. On the other hand, if you're in France, people will say, well, our society's more together, it's more, I don't know, collegiate's the word that's used in universities, but people look after each other more. So it's a difference. But I just wanted to show you those two things, because people often think that every country's the same. They're all doing the same thing. The graph's cut down in a bit, don't worry, it's not all going to be graphs. Here's that figure again for Britain with some more dots filled in. If you remember, I said 6% in the late 1970s for top 1%. After tax, the best off 1% only got 4%, 4 times the average income. Today that would be about £100,000. And that's what I grew up in my childhood. That was what Britain was like back then. Whereas you've grown up, if you've grown up in Britain, in a country that's up there, where the gaps between people have been much wider. I just think it matters to realise it hasn't always been like this, and it changes at a particular time, and also it changes very slowly. The big change before was probably around about 1912, just over 100 years ago, when the Titanic sank, just before the First World War. Politics was changing, people were getting angry about the level of inequality. Not that angry, but pretty angry. The First World War had quite an effect. A lot of the sons of the people who owned the big houses actually got killed, which ended up spreading wealth if you have inheritance tax. And then something happened after the First World War that had a very big effect in Britain on people running the country. See if you can...
The Labour Party.
The Labour Party were getting stronger and bigger, and were getting more votes. The trade unions were getting stronger. Women, yes, although we gave the women the votes, yet women over 21 got the vote in which year? I don't know. Might be 1918. Could be wrong. But something very big happened. Yeah, but we became more equal before the Depression, before 1929. Something before then.
Did we bring in benefits?
Lloyd George began to bring in benefits. Yes, before that which shows that things were changing. General strike 1926, that helped, but something before the general strike. Exactly, I think. This is my opinion. why did we get this fall from up here down? And lots of things mattered. I think emancipation of women actually helped as well. But you've got to think yourself back. In 1919, you suddenly have a country taken over and the people at the top are shot. This concentrates the minds of people at the top of British society. You can watch people like Beveridge, who did the report in the 1940s, changing his opinions after the Russian Revolution, beginning to care a bit more about poorer people. And I think he became a nicer person, but I think if your world switches from one in which you're always going to rule, and you can rule in the interest of people below you, to a world in which they might one day get guns and shoot you, it could change how you behave. And you've got to, if you're trying to understand what happened then, I think you've got to understand there had just been a revolution in Russia. And there was no reason why there wouldn't be more revolutions across Europe. But then things got, if you look how fast it occurred, 1930s, 1940s, all before the Second World War. Second turning point in the 70s, which academics love to debate about precisely what it was and so on. The only thing I will say about my opinion is it was just before 1978. So it wasn't just Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, but it's very interesting. The key reason we're going on about this to you is that we're back up there again. We're incredibly unequal again. There's unlikely to be a Russian Revolution, but there are all kinds of things going on around the periphery of Europe. But there's kind of two ways of going. Either the country's going to become more and more unequal, and that's going to carry on going upwards, and the best off 1% will get more and more, or we're at a tipping point and it's going to come down again. And we have no idea which way it's going to go. I'll ignore the other graphs. Things are very different in different countries. Lots of people say, why can't we just become a more equal country? We like equality. It's not quite as easy as that. The best way to become a more equal country is to lose a war. So one problem Britain has, very good at losing small wars. There's a brilliant book called Losing Small Wars that Yale University Press just published. But because Britain hasn't lost a big war for quite a long time, the people at the top of society tend to stay at the top. What you're looking at here is the top 1% in Japan and Germany. In Japan, the top 1% had an aristocracy and had almost as much as our top 1%. The war changed all that. What did the Americans do once they invaded Japan? Shout out louder. They did put in a form of capitalism, but an interesting one. They nuked them. Yeah, 2 nuclear bombs. Why did they drop? I mean, I don't know. What was one of the reasons why they dropped the nuclear bombs?
To show them power.
Pearl Harbor, was that right? The Soviets, yes. The Americans felt they couldn't wait, because if they waited and just fought a conventional war, the Soviets could have got into Japan first. And the Americans were very scared of spreading communism. Which gives you a clue to what America did next.
Increase trade too much.
A bit more trade.
Reconstructed Japan.
Say it again?
They reconstructed Japan.
They reconstructed Japan like a kind of Marshall Plan. But what did reconstruction involve for those people who owned so much of the country, the top 1%?
Redistribution.
Yes? The redistribution of wealth. Which in other words is what do they do to the top 1%? They killed them. Don't think they killed. Don't know. They took their land. The Americans did redistributed the land fairly equally. They did redistribution of wealth. They created a 90% middle class society in a very short amount of time. And they did it probably because they were extremely scared of revolution in Japan. Because what do? You sit there with an occupying force holding you. So what you're seeing here is an incredible natural experiment in what happens if you take an incredibly unequal feudalistic aristocratic society, impose equality upon it, which is what the US did, and then it stays fairly stable, tiny little rise later. And what you get is the healthiest, longest lived people on the planet 30 or 40 years later. I don't think anybody could have predicted that. I certainly don't think the Americans were doing it for that reason. But if you look at what happened to Japan after the war, part of the reason, or part of the correlation with the incredible improvements in Japan, are that Japan wasn't held back by a feudal system of a small number of people owning so much and controlling so much. The same thing happens in Germany, slightly more muted. There's an incredible increase in inequality in the 30s in Germany, which correlated then with the Nazi Party rising. The Marshall Plan and the Americans and us imposed equality upon Germany and the Russians. Russia and the US hitting in the middle of Berlin helped a lot. If you're trying to reduce the power of London, do you imagine two invading forces coming to Britain, stop halfway through London and build a wall? That would stop London being quite so powerful. And if you like, that's what happened to Berlin. There was then a plan that all the regions should be relatively equal, all the big cities should have a purpose. So if you impose greater equality on Germany, you end up with a fairly efficient, powerful country, which might have been harder to make this case 6 years ago. It's relatively easy to make the case now. But the key point about this is, it isn't that the Japanese and the Germans chose to become more equal. Here's some of the people who would lose their property if we'd been invaded. But it isn't just the old aristocracy. They're actually dying out by themselves. We've got half as many dukes as we had 100 years ago. If anybody wants a fascinating research project, I'd love to know about why is the fertility of our dukes so low? What's going? There's something going on. There's loads of articles in the Daily Telegraph saying how terrible this is, and that we need to create new ones. Okay, two more countries for you. Again, when you hear things about the global race and we've all got to compete together and you've got to reward people at the top a lot, otherwise you'll lose economically, always ask about the Netherlands and Switzerland. This is how much the top 1% get in the Netherlands and Switzerland. And again, they started off getting a fifth of all income, around about 1920. But they've ended up down here. So the Netherlands, the best off 1%, have a similar amount of money to what the 1% had here when I was going to university. It's a different society. It's particularly good at keeping top 1% down. So as I told you earlier, it's a middle country when you're looking at more general income inequality differences. But the kind of thing you get from the Netherlands is that the boss of Royal Dutch Shell a few years ago saying publicly, if you paid me twice as much, I wouldn't work any harder. And if you paid me half as much, I'd work just as hard. And I've never heard any boss in Britain ever say anything like that, which shows you a kind of cultural difference. Switzerland, the top 1% get roughly half as much as our top 1%. So when people say if you tax people more in Britain, they'll all fly off to Geneva, they might fly off to Geneva because Geneva's beautiful and the mountains are lovely and so on, which to be honest I could understand, but they will be taking a hit on their income because they get paid less at the top in Geneva and in Zurich, so on. And I'll let you read this. Those two countries did it without losing a war, but with a kind of degree of solidarity that may be a bit different to Britain. Here's a quote by Patrick Dunleavy. Patrick Dunleavy, quite a middle of the road professor of politics. But I thought I'd put it up. I sort of feel I should put it up for people who are students, because it does make it clear that something quite dramatic is happening at the moment to do with inequality and thinking. Because you know I said that that graph could carry on going up, the top 1% could get more and more and more. If you want that graph to carry on going up, you need a more individualistic culture. You need people to think, if I just work hard enough, I could be at the top. If people aren't at the top, it's because they haven't worked hard enough. And one claim that Patrick makes there is that part of the changing of university funding will move things towards a more individualistic culture, where there may be people who think it's absolutely fine that I've got this very large debt because I will succeed economically and will write it off, and if people don't, they just haven't tried hard enough. Health, to get back to health again. There's a book called The Spirit Level, of which there's been lots of debate about, which is worth looking at, about inequalities in wealth and income and inequalities in health. This graph is a new graph that came out last year, and on the bottom you've got measures of inequality in wealth, and then you've got life expectancy. And you'll see this general relationship. Now, the country which shares out the most, Japan, people seem to live the longest. The country where they share out the least, USA, they live the shortest. The thing which is new in that graph to things produced before is that Denmark's down over the USA. Denmark's quite an equal country by income inequality, but not by wealth. For years, people have been trying to work out why do the Danes smoke. Danish people smoke at a much higher rate than other Europeans. And it might be possible that Danes smoke more because they're a bit annoyed at the other Danes who got all the cash. But I just thought I'd show you that relationship. This is why people are interested in health or interested in inequalities in income and wealth. Because if there's a reason for this, if it's actually partly causal, which we do not yet know, it does matter. Because your health's one of the most important things. You know, you might want to get rich, you might want to have a successful career, you might want to have a happy relationship and so on. But you're at the age where you're pretty healthy. As you get older, to be honest, not getting a life-threatening disease kind of rises up in. It would be quite nice to go for another year without one of those. Having a good health, having a nice life expectancy, spending time with other people that you like, increases as importance to people as they get older. When you look at what people's desires are. Health used to be all about stopping infectious diseases. Cholera is the one that the Broad Street pump has got to do with. And it's kind of moved from how can we stop infectious diseases spreading because we largely think we know how to do that, to how do we cope with the things that lie behind the reasons that we become more healthy. So it's not can we stop people smoking, it's what is it that encourages people to smoke, what makes it easier not to smoke. Or, if we were to get another epidemic like cholera, how would our society behave? What kind of society behaves well if you have a sudden disaster, and what kind of society behaves badly? There's a new infectious disease that's killing 50% of people at the moment. I've forgotten its name. It hasn't killed many. It will probably just blip away and go. But supposing that turns out to be one of the big pandemic diseases, one thing that will be interesting for researchers in the years after this disease spreads around the world and kills many people will be what happens in different countries. Because when you get a pandemic, a lot of people die from the disease, but a lot of people, often more people, die because society breaks down when you have a disease. So all the old people in flats around here who are relying on people coming to bring them food or take them to the hospital, they're the ones who die, even if they don't get the disease, because other people run away. So when you get a disease spreading, part of what matters for the general survival rate of people is how well people work together. I'll give you two examples to think about. When Hurricane Katrina hit the US, how people behaved in Louisiana, what happened, when the National Guard was sent in and so on. And contrast that with when the tsunami hit the eastern coast of Japan. and how people behaved. It's a very different behaviour of society. Too few dots there, so let's go forward. It is a contentious area. This is how much the best off 1% take and how long people live. And you'll see, if you forget about Argentina, you could say it's all looking a bit random. I won't go into the detail of why, but it is a current area of research. People are interested in it. It's not completely obvious that this should be the case. Lots of arguments are given as to why health is worse in more unequal countries. You have more people who are poor, but also the effects of being unequal might drag you down. But also more unequal countries might simply organise things less well. So the USA has the highest health spending in the world, and the highest as a proportion of GDP. I think it's 16%. But it spends most of that money on people who are perfectly healthy. If you spend health spending on people who are not actually ill, but who've got a high income, you're not going to improve health overall. This picture was taken last year in Singapore. There's a family in Singapore looking at the list of survivors from the Titanic that happened 100 years earlier. The Titanic kind of revealed how wide social class differences in Britain had got. The survivor rates sort of showed how people were treated. And the interesting thing here is that this family are living in a country which is as unequal as Britain was at the time the Titanic crashed. But they're probably fairly unaware of that. There are increases in awareness. There's lots of viral poster campaigns going on. This is quite an old one. I always feel sorry for Stephen. He's running the Royal Bank of Scotland on our behalf. So it's in effect a nationalised bank. That's his body shaped by his salary. And the poor bloke, even his mum and dad said that they were embarrassed by him. And about the salary he got. Often people get angry with me when I say I feel sorry for him, but I sort of I do in a way. But this is a way of, well, you sort of think what you could do with that, and you might feel less sorry from him. It's a way of thinking about the differences between individuals in an unequal society. Does he need that much to get him to be running that bank? Oh, just to go back, to be fair to Stephen, do you remember Bob Diamond, who was sent back? It's kind of debatable what Bob's real take-home pay was, but it was at least 20 or 30 million. So what you've got to imagine here is another figure 10 times bigger than Stephen, who's not having to run a nationalised bank, who's getting to strut off to Davos and so on. So if you want to understand why Stephen feels upset, there's the massive figure of Bob Diamond over here. So that looks like him. Here's the hospital consultant, on just under 100,000, who feels upset because he's trained for years to be a hospital consultant, but these bankers are getting all of this. There's a police sergeant who knows he can get beaten up on a Friday night and is working just as long hours as a hospital consultant, but isn't paid as much because hospital consultants are seen as posher. And here's the secondary school teacher who's upset because they're paid a lot less than the police and they're teaching kids. And you can go down, wherever you are in this hierarchy, the people above you are getting too much, and the people below you don't deserve it because they're not as qualified as you are. And it's a kind of nasty little hierarchy.
I don't understand why people would be upset. Surely you would pity the people that earn more than you because they're not getting a rewarding job out of it, and you should be happy because you're changing people's lives and stuff. Like, that's what would make me happy if I was earning less.
If you were here, if you were doing medicine.
Well,
Go on.
maybe not medicine.
Yeah.
That's,
Oh, if you're a teacher.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or a nurse. Like, I consider nursing, and everyone's like, oh, it's not good money, you're not treated well. But that shouldn't drive you to be a nurse anyway.
Yeah.
the caring for other people.
You repeat the question,
Okay, what she's saying is, shouldn't people go into jobs because of reasons other than money? For instance, becoming a nurse because you want to care for people, or a teacher because you're going to get some joy from teaching. I would agree with you, but I was brought up by two parents who met dragging a cart of flowers into the city. So I'm a product of the flower children. But me and you, we're unusual. I'd say you could all shout out we're not, and maybe the revolution is happening again. Most people in Britain think that they should get paid what they are worth, and then talk about their worth as reflecting somehow the effort that has gone into getting them there. So I've talked to young medics who say we should be paid a lot, 80 or 100,000, because we've sacrificed to study medicine. And I kind of think, when you were 18, 19, 20 or 21, you were lucky enough to be able to learn how to stop people dying, and you describe this as some kind of sacrifice.
I think people just don't go in with the right mindset.
And I'd agree.
If you're a consultant, you know that you're going to be sort of putting pressure on family. If you want to, you are putting your career first. So
you should be paid more because you're putting your career.
No, I don't think you should necessarily be paid more. You should just love your job.
It's easier to love your job in a society where everybody else loves their job. It's hard to be a saint. I've got a friend I went to university with called Mazza. I don't think it would mind me telling this story. I met Mazza when I was 18 at a student flats in Newcastle. Mazza had lived till he was 10 in Pakistan and had held a donkey that went round a well. But he got to Huddersfield when he was 11, and he got to go to Newcastle to study dentistry when he was 18. Mazza went to study dentistry because he wanted to stop people's teeth hurting. He got the shock of his life in that first week at Newcastle when he found out that most of the other dentists were there because they'd failed to become doctors. And they weren't there because they cared about teeth. They never thought about teeth until they'd failed to get into medical school. They were there because they wanted a doctor's salary and prestige and so on. And then he managed to get his medical degree. He now works in Manchester, and if you're unlucky enough to be in a car crash or a fight and to lose the front of your face, Mazza will be the person who reconstructs your jaw and teeth for you. He says it's great in Manchester because there's enough business. But he's NHS. But my sort of sad point about this is that Mazza is unusual. What's normal, and this was years ago, this was more equal Britain. What's normal is for people to value their own income and status and so on a bit more. So that when we look at doctors, we find that the majority of doctors live in the south of England, away from where people are ill. And it isn't, I don't think it's people's fault. They're just normal. It's, but
I don't see it. Well, I think it's sad that it's normal.
I'd agree it's sad, and it can change, it can be different. There were periods where people went into things like medicine because they wanted to make people better as the primary reason.
But what makes your brain not be able to think, like what is it that's stopping you being able to think,
About
appreciate?
We tend to think what other people tell, you think like the society that you're in, and you'll tend to have views like other people. There'll be a range, but you're within a range of what's normal for the situation you've grown up in. So I'm only a lefty hippie because I grew up with lefty hippies.
I didn't. Neither of my parents think.
You could be the person who's going to help change society. Let's go on. What do you?
I would actually say that also I'm in the same. I didn't grow up in a hippie world, and I now sort of almost am. But one of the issues, not supporting either point, with definitely the nurses and perhaps the school teachers, is that down in those kind of businesses where you'd like to be able to make a difference and get the rewarding job from it, it becomes the way that the NHS, etc., and maybe schools are structured, is that it makes it very, very difficult to make a difference that you want to, because it's so understaffed and because you actually can't give the primary care that you want to the patients.
Yeah. Any other points on this before we move?
Well, I've don't think we should go so specifically, talking about its job and how it feels like and how it should be like. But I think we should consider the fact that how is determined what we are both paying to be paid for. I mean, how as a doctor why am I supposed to get paid 80,000, 1,000? How is that determined by the society itself? And I think this is the important thing. And why should a banker be paid more than a teacher? Why? Who is determining this thing in the society? And the other let's say, point to make here is that I think it's a systemic flaw. I mean, capitalism, as it is today, is producing inequality. As it is, it's not going ever to be equal. So this is, I think, the question to ask: how can we change capitalism? How can we move forward to actually bring all these people in equal states as much as possible as it is? But I think the question that's the number one question. Number two question is who is determining? Who is determining, how much you should be paid for? How does this function in society? It's very important.
Yeah. On your general point, what I think is interesting is how much variety you have under capitalism. That some countries, as capitalist countries, are so different from some other capitalist countries. The determining can be partly chance. So doctors' wages rose so recently because somebody made a mistake under New Labour of the formula for funding them. They've got a very powerful union, although they've never, as far as I'm aware, gone on strike yet. But it's a little bit of chance. And the bankers are partly, they did work out that they have the money and they could decide to pay themselves more. And nobody stopped them.
The golden boys.
Yeah. But it's the power to negotiate your own salary or not. So the trade union, and trade unions will be part of the problem, and I hate it when you say this, but the trade union who gets their workers paid the most are the airline union, and they get the Qantas pilots paid $250,000 a year, and they claim this is good for all workers, but it's a lot of money. But it's those negotiations, and if you can't negotiate, you can watch your position slip down and down and down, and then the country can negotiate you in general by having a minimum wage. That's part of it. Let's zoom forward. Okay. I was lucky the slide came up. In answer to your secondary question, you're living through a very strange time in general. This is another thing to try and make you interested. This is world population change. I've forgotten what the reason was I had for this slide, but it does fit your question better. Up until 1850, world population was going up very, very slowly. After that, we have a world population boom, where in some years it's going up 2% a year. That's how we get from 1 billion people to 7 billion people, and how we're going to get to about 9, maybe 10 billion people. The reason for putting the graph up, to show you, is the end of it. The last 30, 40 years, something different's happened. World population has slowed down. It matters from the point of view of, we'll get back to inequality in health, don't worry in a minute, but the point of view of your question about capitalism, what's going to occur. Capitalism works quite well when you have growing populations. It's not hard to be a successful business person, almost always a businessman, if you hang on for 10 years, the number of people you've got to sell your widgets to is higher because world population's going up, let alone other ways of spreading markets and so on. Your odds on to be profitable, if you see what I mean. The point of showing you this is that that's become harder since 1970 because we've got a slowdown in population growth. We haven't yet got a slowdown in population, but something very different's happened. And it matters from the point of view of you because you're going to be looking down, I'll be dead here, and you're going to be at an interesting point. The world's changing, essentially. Some more fertility pictures for you. Not the most exciting fertility pictures you could have. Here's how many babies people have. There's life expectancy. If you've got very good eyesight, you can work out which countries. But these are rapid changes that are going on. Average family in the world's got 3 children right now. Their children projected to have 2. So you're going to be alive at the first point since the Black Death, when global population stops rising. And all this matters for health and health inequalities. Because people get valued differently when you have fewer people. I'm going to give you 7 kind of arguments about why equalities or greater equality is a fairly useful thing, just to try and stir you up. So please jump in with any of these. People have known that equality is good for a very long time. If you go through most world religions, you'll often find that they include within them some argument for treating people a bit more equally, for usurping the power of people at the top. They can also make things worse, but go on.
On that point, there's some very interesting graphs of religiosity versus inequality.
Yeah. Go on.
I think there is quite a correlation I've seen. But
Yeah. In which way?
high religiosity is associated with more inequality.
Yes. Yeah. There is a sense of being more religious can be associated with more inequality. People are more likely to turn to God when things become more unequal. My favourite is the Old Kent Road in London. If you go along the Old Kent Road, you'll find a new church every 50 metres, a new evangelical church. And I can't help thinking it's partly because there's nothing else in the Old Kent Road for. I won't dig myself, but there's certainly that relationship. It also depends what you mean by religion. So if you look at people's religious practices in Japan, it can look a very unreligious place, or it can look religious depending on how you look at it.
But religion has different attitudes in different places in the world, because things like equality are almost polar opposite to some areas of Buddhism where they practice things like enoughness and strive for happiness and emotional kind of satisfaction rather than monetary and possession stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think that religion, I don't want to start a debate about religion now.
Yeah.
But what I would say here is that religion does promote inequality. It does talk about equality afterlife, in afterlife.
Yes.
In this life, it says, okay, be who you are, be a peasant, and just pray.
And you'll
pray
still
to
be
God.
okay later
Yeah,
on.
have your own position, your tiny position in the society. Don't move upwards and downwards. Be there and just keep praying. In the afterlife, you're going to be equal as the other.
I'd agree. I mean, I'm not, but I'm just putting. I think you can make a case that religions often started at a time of great inequality, partly as a reaction when the Romans were occupying Jerusalem, right? And they get usurped, and the rich and powerful take them over again. You know, the people who were controlling the priests who were quite nice in those slums in that country in Latin America. We've got 7 to get through now. Here's an interesting one. People often say that you get more creativity if you have inequality. But when you look at the numbers on things like patents or how many scientific articles are written, you tend to find that, I think it's Norway or Finland has the highest number of scientific articles per person. Japan has the highest number of patents. All this idea that you get more entrepreneurship and creativity, it's very hard to find any evidence for it. Although unequal countries love to say it, but it's hard to find. The Leonardo da Vinci thing is really interesting. He was sponsored by, is it the Medicis? You're clever enough, somebody will ignore me. But the story I read about him was that they had a system of once they let you in, they treated you fairly equally to give you the time and the space to do things. But there's an argument about creativity and inequality. I'll zoom forward until you shout out. If any of you are good at writing down web addresses, I'll make the slides available anyway. There's a lovely paper that came out last year that said that in Italy, the football teams that pay their players more equally do better than the football teams that pay one kind of David Beckham a lot of money.
Well, isn't that to do with teamwork?
Yeah,
That's the way I view football from my very non-footballing
yes.
cynicism, is that most players as a team are actually out for themselves, and they don't really care about passing to the other members of the team much and things like that.
They do that. But the interesting thing is, football's nice because everybody at the top knows the salaries, they're public, they're speculated, so that people know in these top teams in Milan or whatever what people are paid. And the impression, the paper goes into amazing detail, the impression is people may pass slightly less than the person giving a lot of money, Because it might be subconscious. Why are you going to let him get another goal when he's already paid 5 times more than you? Whereas the advantage of having a more equal pay structure in the Italian league is apparently the equivalent of playing every game at home. That's as opposed to playing away. But there's lots of work coming out about whether you do get better bankers when you allow a few to be very highly paid, whether you get a better system when there's less difference between people.
Just on that last point, if it's more equal, but there is still divisions from in the pay gaps.
Yeah.
Could it be possible that the fact that there's a small gap means that the one above you is attainable, whereas some people who are lower think that the top one is just unattainable?
That's the effect. That's related to things like social mobility. So one problem you get in a country like Britain or the States is that when you get very wide gaps, it's very hard for people at the top to envisage their children being in lower paid jobs because you'd have so much less. So you tend to get very low social mobility then. In countries which are much more equal in terms of pay, it's easier to think of one of your children who might not want to be a very good accountant or something else, having a job which is more average, and so social mobility is higher. There's a question about what kind of income inequality you think is fair. How much would it be okay for some people to get paid more than others? Whether it's 10 times or 6 times or 20 times or 30 times. Has anybody got any views on that? What would you, or even in a utopian society, any of you think everybody should get the same? Or if they don't think they should get the same, what's the fair difference? Imagine you're working in some organisation in 10 years' time. What would you think would be fair to have as a difference? Any suggestions?
Well, what you say about utopian society is that, from my point of view, is it's all well and good everyone being paid the same, but the rewards that you're going to be getting from that is your well-being and happiness. So I'd quite like, in that respect, I wouldn't mind being paid equal as everyone else to do a job that requires more hours or more skills if the rewards meant that my well-being was better.
Okay, you and then you and then you.
I think it doesn't really matter as long as you've got, let's say, the basic things already done for you. I mean, if you've got a really good education for free, a really good health system for free, if you've got really good benefits, if you've got really huge social security structure,
then the inequalities don't matter.
You get all the basics, you get access to a good education, you get. It's a kind of a socialistic, libertarian capitalism, I would say.
Yeah.
But from that sense, I think it doesn't really matter after a certain point if you get the basics and if you get what you
It's just the cost of doing that is about 50% of your GDP.
Yeah, I know, it is.
So you can't afford rich people as well.
Yeah.
But one at the back?
Absolutely, in a utopian society.
Yes.
How about the least rewarding the job, the higher the pay?
Yes.
If you clean somebody's toilet, you're getting paid higher than if you're a teacher or
Yeah. North Sea oil divers. They just wouldn't do it. I'd love, there's an argument for having a basic income. Everybody gets £10,000 a year, and then you get paid more if people don't want to do the job. So universities would find it easy to get lecturers. People love to be lecturers. No need to pay people. But this is utopia. I'm interested in, on the steps on the way, what could you do? Go on.
Well, the closest we've really come in our society to an utopia, I think, would be communism, where everybody got paid the same and everybody was treated equally. But I guess even if we can see on the example of Russia, where for a long time communism was a good thing, where everybody was equal, nobody got more than anybody else. But in the end it collapsed, because there will be people who were thinking, well, I should be getting more. Because even though everyone's getting paid the same, someone's doing more, someone's doing less. Yeah. And people are not happy about it, there will always be the egoistic me that wants to get more.
Yeah.
There was huge inequality in Russia.
Yeah. There were people were somewhere well paid. What's the word that they called Strava? What's the steel worker who worked forever? Yeah. That's cool.
I will still support, let's say, my utopian society, but I think it's possible for a really good tax system. I mean, redistribution of wealth. You got the tax dodgers now at the top. I mean, all the big corporations bypassing the laws, finding loopholes, going to avoid taxes. So if you get a really strict and really well done, let's say, tax system that actually taxes the rates and feeds the poor in a way, you know, this is what actually matters. We can build a really good social security structure that, you know, inequality is actually.
I do agree with you. I think you could. Some of you could get to see this. I think I'll be dead, but I think you could, which is why. But it'll only ever happen if people are bothered. Let's do two more, and then I'll get through me.
At the same time, like people who are in poverty now wouldn't necessarily be in poverty if they were, you know, if they were given the chance to be as driven as not that they aren't driven, but if they were given the chance that successful people are given. So the people in poverty I think could easily be the ones that are earning as much money, because people are selfish. If you're not living selflessly, you're sort of living to make yourself better. So I think it's got, like, I don't really know what point I'm trying to make, but
I'm going to stop you.
I think to add to that, a lot of that starts with kind of like infant psychology and what we're kind of taught in our educational systems. It's kind of like certain like demographic areas will kind of have like external problems outside of like the educational institution, and that kind of like will shape like whatever the institutions will teach. That will still be shaped by the outside. Like, so say if like you're from a poor area, regardless of like say something's like, oh, you can do what you want, no, they will see like their environment and just feel like I cannot get out of this regardless. I mean, look at my parents. And like it's kind of like it needs to branch out more. Like this problem kind of needs to be confronted on kind of like an external level. Like it should be like taught that regardless of who you are, you can kind of become more of a fulfilling person. Like you shouldn't really strive for the money, but rather like for self-fulfillment. And anybody can achieve that. There's no such thing as like being too smart or
Yeah.
It's kind of like
I agree with you.
Standardisation.
I'm going to move it forward because I've got some pretty graphs to show you right at the end, and I don't want to miss out on my pretty graphs. Good news. You don't often get told good news. Last year there was the biggest 5% decline in infant mortality in world history. Just look out for the good news because they don't tend to report it. Just one other point. One problem when you have growing wage inequality is you run out of money because it costs lots of money to pay people at the top. So if you look at the top 10% in Britain, they're now paid, say, roughly double what they were in real terms compared to the 70s. The GP might get 110, they'd get the equivalent in today's money of 50,000 at 1970s pay. Still be the top 10%. If you take the top 10% and move their salaries back to what they were, that difference, then everybody who's unemployed under 25 could be employed 10 times over. You'd have enough money for it. So there are these arguments as to why a bit more equality would help. The things that most interest me are the not obvious ones, the tangential ones. And one is when I was going to school, most people walked to the nearest school. That's what you did. You went to the nearest school, you walked or you cycled. Now there's a huge amount of kids crossing over, going much further to school, ignoring the schools that are nearest to them. There's also lots of paranoid parents who are walking with their children up to the age of 10 or 11 to school. And you've got this incredible slavery of parents, mostly mothers. You can see them in the morning in Sheffield, taking children to school. Whereas in a more equal society, if going to the local school is fine, there's the amount of time for these parents is reduced. And I'd love to pick up more examples like that you don't think of how things can be better.
When I was in Haiti, I had Mackinson, he was 4, and we were going to drive somewhere or walk somewhere really far from his house, and I was like, is he allowed to come with us? And somebody just laughed at me that they're just
Yes,
let them
allowed.
do what they want.
When I was 6 in Britain, I had a trike, three-wheel trike, and I cycled over 1/4 of my city and explored it on my own. I mean, and this, I don't say you should do that anymore with children necessarily, but the way in which we are so frightened of things that we cotton wool, this is in middle class areas, cotton wool kids. Soon forward from that. Okay, going to end with 5 graphs for you. These are gentle things that might be related to health inequality. So let's go look at the richest 25 countries in the world again. How much meat people eat, meat and fish, how much water they consume, how much waste they produce, how much they fly, and their overall footprint. Just go through those. I'm going to highlight Portugal because I've got to do this talk in Portugal. Because the way that was fair for Portugal. If I can get there, because there's a general strike in Portugal. So it makes it really hard to go and talk about a general strike when there's a general strike. Here's this inequality measure. So the UK is around about here. Best off 10th gets almost 14 times the worst off 10th. And here's Japan. Best off 10th, just over 4 times the poorest 10th. And here's how much meat and fish people consume. So in the USA, they consume about 120 kilograms a year, largely of meat. This is burgers, if you like. We are on 80, so we're doing well. We're doing a third less than the USA. But the Japanese are consuming half as much as us of meat and fish. A bit of fish is good for you, but it's just, we don't need to consume as much meat and fish as we do. But the interesting question is, why on earth should there be a relationship with income inequality and the eating of meat? And there's lots of possible arguments, and it's very hard to test. Everything from, in more unequal countries, people advertise more. The spend on advertisement is much, much higher. So you know small children in Britain can recognise the McDonald's arches before they can speak their first word. If you have a country with less advertising, you get less of that. But also, a country where more people are all together, it's easier to not let yourselves be exploited by people trying to get you to shove meat down your gullet at a rate that even if you like meat, is not good for you. It certainly isn't the rich eating more meat. It's not possible. If the rich in the United States ate disproportionately more meat, they'd die. So it'll be like that, you know, have you seen Super Size Me?
Yeah.
That film, okay. So it's not that. It's that. It's getting the poor to eat more. But that's just a general relationship. It's interesting. And often the countries that don't fit on here are interesting too. Singapore, similar darts to Japan. But can you guess what that little dot up there is? No, could do. Australia would be good. Yeah. Nearer to home, high meat eating country. Denmark, yes. It's Denmark and then pigs. Apparently the pigs start off life in Barcelona and get shipped up. And then get killed in Denmark. But Denmark's up there. Water use. This is domestic water use, but it's just interesting that
Almost the same graph.
you might. What's that?
Almost the same graph.
Almost the same.
Really similar.
So
Yeah.
the UK is far lower down.
Yeah, except that why are we here?
It rains a lot.
Yeah, it does rain, so we don't need to use the water. And something else that other countries have.
We don't have any swimming pools.
Yes, absolutely spot on. You got it right on. And Australia uses a lot. There's not much point having a swimming pool, but people have them. Well, you know, look out when you're flying. Come to flights in a minute. It's amazing how many people in Britain have got swimming pools, and it's partly a little status. You know, and these are tiny little pools. They're completely useless. You can do nothing in them. You don't even want to be in them. But thankfully, because it's so cold, we're not up here. But I'm not saying we don't know why these things are so strong. It's just interesting that people are beginning to look and see them. Waste is my favourite one. Waste is a brilliant measure of consumption. This is kilograms per person per year. It's a measure along the side. Apart from, I think it's almost only jewellery you don't throw away. Almost everything you buy that you've bought in your life is going to become waste, often very, very quickly. Oh, food's the other one, becomes waste in another way. But the packaging on the food, the clothes you're buying, it all becomes waste. So we can use waste as a measure of how frivolous are you. The average person wears items of clothing about 12 times in this country. In other countries they wear clothes for longer. The longer you wear your clothes, if you wear them out, you'll create less waste.
Do you know at all what that graph looked like sort of 50 years ago? Because
No.
I know that, like, as far as clothing and just the way that society's become more consumerist, because I know that we had a similar, we had better equality, but we kind of clothes, you just sort of wear it till it completely wore out and it was an investment rather than a commodity.
I know for the UK that we consume 6 times less per person. Our parents did than we do. And it's not just the inequality, it's partly more stuff became made, and also stuff became delivered in a way that increased the waste. So in Arsenal you used to get milk in glass bottles that got cleaned and used again. But we can't get this kind of data for all these countries. It's very hard to get for 20, 30, 40 years ago. But it just shows the general relationship.
Can you just explain again what the relative size of the plots on the graphs is represented?
Oh, sorry, I should do. I never explained in the first place, you're right. We've made the circles equal to the population of the countries, so that you keep on looking at the USA because it's a lot of people, and you don't get distracted by these little places because they're less important. And Japan's the next biggest one. And there's an argument in the research field against this. I think we should do this, so I do it. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who do the Spirit Level, want to treat all these countries absolutely equal because they see them as all natural experiments, and each experiment is of similar importance. But partly because I worked out how to make the circles different sizes on the graph. Go on.
Do you know why Singapore has such higher waste?
Oh, why is it so high? Yes, it's where to go off. It's partly because it's an island, I think. So it might be easier. It's not a great app, actually, because New Zealand's very good at being efficient. No, I have to be honest, I don't. But if you ever go to Singapore, partly because it's the world shipping lanes go past. If you go to the beach, it's awful because it's just covered in waste. And that isn't from people in Singapore, it's from come off all the ships that are going past. There are often idiosyncratic reasons for extremes. Now, if you're in a country which is having to deal with a lot of waste that isn't your own making, why worry so much about recycling yourself? Because your major waste problem is stuff coming off ships going past you, and all the petrochemicals. Okay, flights. There are some obvious things that affect some countries' flights. If you're an island, there's more incentive to fly. But again, you'll see this relationship. And the one I point out is Germany, where it's not normal for business people to fly. You take the train. And when you do that, you get slightly cheaper trains, the better trains, and it's quicker. Whereas we talk in Britain about High Speed 2 reducing the flights from Birmingham. I can't believe people fly from Birmingham to Heathrow, but apparently they do. They don't stop. Well, it doesn't make any sense, but Manchester to London certainly get flights. But it's just this sort of. And there's Canada, to give you an example, it obviously makes more sense in somewhere like Canada to fly. It makes less sense in somewhere like Italy, where it's not that hard in Italy, given its sort of shape, to put a few train lines in the right direction. But again, it's the overall pattern. Weakest relationships with footprint, ecological footprint. This is how many planets are thinking. No, it's not. It's a different measure. Anyway, the higher up you are, the less green you are. And it's not quite as strong, although the footprint measurements are not brilliant. They still need to improve between countries. But again, it's there. The countries where people buy less, consume less, recycle more, make things last more, think about flying a bit more critically, do better. Perhaps I'll answer your questions about why I made the circles bigger. If you didn't make the USA big here, you wouldn't necessarily see much. On the other hand, if you were to take the USA and create 50 odd little circles for each state, they would suddenly dominate the picture. Go on.
Right, so these are indicators of inequality in some ways. That's what you're trying to show, is that there's a correlation. Right? Is that right?
Yeah,
Or
well,
is that why I didn't ask that?
in a more unequal country, it changes people's behaviour, not just the people at the top.
Yeah.
Although, people at the bottom buy. So the poorest 10% in the USA tend to have air conditioning and consume a lot.
I'm just wondering whether by changing these factors, using like for waste, by kind of putting infrastructure in for reducing waste or something like that, does that affect inequality, or is it just an indicator of it? Can you change inequality by
The other way round.
the other way around?
That's really interesting. I mean, if you were to reduce flights, most people who fly in Britain are middle class. It's not people going on cheap holidays who are working class. If you were to make fewer flights leave the country, there would be less need for your high income. Now, what would you do with that high income if you couldn't fly abroad? I'm saying, if you were more strict about how much people could buy and didn't just let people buy as much as they want, again, what need would there be for the money? I've not thought about it until you said it that way. I'm going to keep you had a lot, so I'm going to definitely let you finish on the hour. Those are data sources. This was just done in 5 minutes. It'd be great if any of you are interested in doing this yourselves. It needs to be done. It was done a couple of years ago. They need to be updated and looked at more carefully. And we need to know in which direction these things are going in. And often the directions are actually very hopeful. In many things, they're getting slightly better now. Not better fast enough to stop the planet burning up and all dying, but at least slightly better. Just same as some ecological footprint map for you. The red countries are the ones where you need 2 to 4 planets if everybody behaved like them. Are you familiar with this kind of thing? So yeah, that's how one way the world's changed. 10 years ago, you spent ages explaining about footprints of it. So USA 4 planets, but even Japan, you need at least 2 planets so everybody behaves like the Japanese behave. If people behave like it in India and most of Africa, you can get away with 1 planet, but poverty catch you at the end, promise. If you change the map, so it's a bit like the bubbles, you're getting bigger. Here we've just made the countries the size of their populations, and you suddenly see that the ones behaving badly are much smaller on a population map. So Africa's about 1 billion, India's about 1 billion, China's about 1 billion. It doesn't look quite so bad if you do it this way. And then the last of these 3 ones makes the countries proportional to their footprint, so you can see how much pollution is coming. And again, it begins to look bad again. I know I've gone through those quite quickly, but I'm just showing you something else about looking at things differently. So this is the reason for showing you these, is that these 25 rich countries really matter, because these are the polluting countries. These are the ones where everybody can't carry on behaving like us, otherwise you're going to run out of stuff much faster. So one argument to be concerned about inequality, wage inequality and income inequality in rich countries, is if you don't sort rich countries out, you're telling people in India, you just need to get cars. If you all get cars, everything will be fine in India. Already in India, they've cut down on the programs where they send a nurse to people who are giving birth to try to stop the babies dying and the mothers dying. And the reason they've stopped sending the midwives to births is because they've found more midwives were dying on the back of motorcycles on the way to the birth than actually saving lives. And that's part of my worry about why you can't just tell people in India they just need to buy more stuff and everything will be fine. But if you can't get your rich world country sorted out, how on earth are you going to do well there? And lastly, two last pictures to end on. This is the Earth at night picture, which you may have seen. It's kind of mocked up by satellite images that show where people are. So wherever there's light, you think that's where people are. But on this kind of a map, we've taken things like the Sahara and completely shrunk it because nobody's there. So each little cell of area on this map is proportional to the number of people who live in that area. So there's Britain, and you can see London's quite large. And the interesting thing about, there's Moscow up there. Here's Madrid, where Conte's bankers on the train, people are still paying 30% too much for their housing. The thing about changing the map and look at it there is that if an area is dark on this map, there are still people there in that area. It's just that they're not wasting electricity shining light up in the sky. Whereas when you look at the normal map of the Earth at night, you think you're looking at a map of people. So here's the planet as a whole, and all the areas that are dark contain people, and they might have light. So hopefully some of them have got light so they can read books, but they haven't got so much light to waste that they're shining it up and polluting. The very last thing I'll end on, we've got the latest data, which I haven't got the map of from NASA for this, and on the latest map, Tokyo's gone much, much darker because people are wasting less electricity in Tokyo because they've shut most of the nuclear, I think all the nuclear power stations, I think, have been shut down now. But Cairo, which is just like a sliver of the Nile there, Cairo's become much brighter from the latest map. But thank you for letting me talk at you for so long. I think we've got it finished at 12, if that's right. If you want to ask any more questions or anything, I'll hang around for a bit of lunch. Just nobble me. So thanks very much. Cheers.